On the 16th of August 1819, 22-year-old war veteran John Lees made his way through the crowd towards the front of the stage. He had just spent the past few years recovering from fighting in the Battle of Waterloo in the 7th Coalition. As the son of a wealthy cotton mill owner, he was eager to finally hear the great orator Henry Hunt call for proper representation in Parliament for the burgeoning cotton towns of the North. As Hunt spoke, Lee noticed the crowd begin to grow larger. Suddenly, men from the Yeomanry Cavalry spilled onto the stage, arresting Hunt and the others, dragging them from the hustings into the mass of confused onlookers. Unable to escape, the panicked cavalry began to lash out with fixed bayonets and sabres. Being packed in with the rest of the crowd, John Lees could do nothing to defend himself. He survived the initial attack, but died weeks later from his injuries. Before his death, he reportedly said to a close friend, "At Waterloo, there was men to man, but here, it was murder." After the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815, the country was plunged into economic turmoil. A recession was looming on the horizon, unemployment was at an all-time low, and the Corn Laws were exacerbating the already floundering crop production, which had almost ceased to exist due to the year without a summer. To top all of this off, only 11% of men at the time had the right to vote, many of which just didn't live in the industrial north. Campaigners at the time realised that petitioning Parliament was their only peaceful solution. This petition gained 750,000 signatures in 1817, but was flatly rejected by the House of Commons. After this major setback, the reformers rebounded, following in the footsteps of French revolutionaries. They mobilised mass parades and held public demonstrations in an attempt to force the government to back down and grant them their own version of the rights of man, which French citizens had been treated to some 30 years before. The 1819 demonstration that would go on to be coined Peterloo by the radical newspaper, the Manchester Observer, was organised by the Manchester Patriotic Union and was held at St. Peter's Field. St. Peter's Field was a piece of land that lay alongside Mount Street and was the site of a recently demolished building. This land had been cleared to make way for the construction of St. Peter's Street. Nowadays, St. Peter's Field would be located close to St. Peter's Square, next to the Midland Hotel. Early in the morning, the Assistant Surveyor of Paving arrived at St. Peter's Field and was charged with removing any stones or debris which could be used as weapons. At approximately 9 a.m, Manchester magistrates met at the Star Inn on Deansgate, where they discussed what to do about the upcoming demonstration. Between 10 a.m. and 10:30, they moved from the pub to Edmund Buxton's house, where they could view the arriving crowds from windows on the first floor. As the magistrates got comfortable, processions from neighbouring towns and villages began to arrive. Each procession was roughly 1,000 to 2,000 reformers strong, all dressed in their Sunday best. Monday the 16th of August 1819 was a particularly warm summer's day, which definitely encouraged people to come out in droves. Each procession would parade through the field with a banner which they would erect beside the hustings. By lunchtime, a crowd of over 60,000 protesters had arrived, making this one of the largest demonstrations that the likes of Manchester had ever seen. In the meantime, the watching magistrates began to take down sworn statements from loyalists that the demonstrations were causing them great discomfort and distress. These statements allowed the magistrates to write arrest warrants for Henry Hunt and the other speakers on the platform. 2 lines of special constables linked arms and began to separate the crowd. This would allow the magistrates to communicate with the speakers if needed. Henry Hunt was the last of the reformers to arrive. He was pulled through the crowd by his supporters in an open-top carriage, alongside the leader of the Manchester Female Reform Society, Mary Fildes. Hunt and Fildes joined the other speakers on the platform to the sound of great applause. Beside him on the platform were reporters from a number of newspapers, such as the Manchester Observer, the Times, the Liverpool Mercury and the Leeds Mercury. Fearing a riot, the magistrates began to summon soldiers from the surrounding area to disperse the crowd. The first to arrive was the Yeomanry Cavalry, a regiment formed of inexperienced shopkeepers and tradesmen that was set up in 1817 in an attempt to deal with the growing social unrest. In their rush to arrive at the scene, they knocked down a young mother on Cooper Street, crushing her 2-year-old child in the process. Although common for the time period, the cavalry had been drinking the hour before whilst eating their lunch. This obviously made their judgment even more clouded and unreliable. As the special constables parted the crowd, the yeomanry charged towards the hustings, knocking down and killing John Ashworth, one of the constables that had been sworn in by the magistrates. After arresting Hunt and tearing down the flags that surrounded the hustings, the yeomanry began to advance into the fleeing crowd, slashing them as they went. Many of the crowd fell in the panic of escaping the cavalry. This led to many being trampled to death by horses. One such victim was William Evans. He was a carter by trade, but had been sworn in by the magistrates to help disperse the crowd. In an ironic twist of fate, Evans was knocked down in the chaos before being trampled by the same very horses that he worked and cared for. He died slowly from internal crushers, succumbing to his injuries in December later that year. Although the crowd were beginning to flee, the yeomanry were stuck, unable to return the way they came, as the pathway had closed in the panic. The stampeding horses threw up a plume of dust, blocking the yeomanry from the magistrate's view. Chairman of the Cheshire Magistrates, William Hulton, commanded the regular cavalry, the 15th Hussars, to enter into the crowd and retrieve the stuck yeomanry. In later investigations conducted by solicitors, he is reported to have said, "Good God, sir, don't you see they are attacking the yeomanry? Disperse the crowd." At roughly 1:30 p.m, they charged into the crowd, sabres drawn, killing between 9 and 17 people and injuring between 400 and 700 more. It was an absolute bloodbath. The 15th Hussars, joined by the Cheshire Yeomanry, began to push the fleeing crowd towards the edge of the field. The crowd got caught in a crush as almost 60,000 people tried to make their way through a pinch point at the end of Wilman Street onto what is now the Great Northern Square. The Yeomanry continued to hack and slash at the now immobile crowd as numerous officers commanded them to stop, reportedly shouting, "For shame, gentlemen, the people cannot get away." In an attempt to escape the yeomanry, many took shelter in the cellars that lined Windmill Street. Many of the formers were panicked and fell down the stairs into the cellars. 38-year-old mother of two, Martha Partington, was crushed to death by other terrified protesters after falling down a set of cellar stairs while trying to flee. As people began to turn back, they were met by infantry stomping across the field from the direction of Peter Street, blocking off more possible escape points. After the dust had finally settled, the dead and injured lay strewn across the abandoned site, seeping blood into the dry, parched ground. In the subsequent days, riots continued to erupt across the city as outraged victims sought revenge for the death and carnage that the yeomanry had caused. One such attack was performed against Robert Campbell, a special constable that had been present on the day of the bloodshed. A mob consisting of over 1,000 people made their way down Mill Street towards his home, chanting, "Kill him, villain." He was wrongfully accused of killing a child the previous day. Campbell managed to fire a shot from his pistol into the crowd before they broke into his house, dragged him into the street and beat him to death. The government's initial instinct was to stand strongly beside the actions of the magistrates and those that were implicated in the events of Peterloo. They cracked down upon those that sought reform. Hunt and a number of others that helped to organise the event were charged, tried and sentenced to 2 years in prison in 1820. Hunt's signature white hat was stabbed at Peterloo, and going forward was seen as a sign of peace. Although somewhat hushed up and unknown by many, the events that took place on the 16th of August 1819 went on to change the course of democracy for future generations. The tariffs and other restrictions placed on import foods would eventually be removed after the Corn Laws were abolished in 1846. Suffrage was not obtained by all men until almost a century later in 1919, the same year that women over 30 gained the right to vote. Universal suffrage was not achieved until 1947, where property qualifications were no longer required. The events of Peterloo were mostly ignored until a Labour government in 1972 placed a blue plaque high on the wall at the Free Trade Hall. This blue plaque reads, "The site of St. Peter's Fields, where on the 16th of August 1819, Henry Hunt, radical orator, addressed an assembly of about 60,000 people. Their subsequent dispersal by the military is remembered as Peterloo." Many were frustrated that the old plaque did not mention the deaths and violence caused on Peterloo, so a new one was installed in 2007. A red plaque now reads, "St. Peter's Fields, the Peterloo Massacre. On the 16th of August 1819, a peaceful rally of 60,000 pro-democracy reformers, men, women and children, were attacked by armed cavalry, resulting in 15 deaths and over 600 injuries." In 2019, shortly before the bicentennial of Peterloo, Manchester City Council unveiled a memorial designed by Jeremy Deller outside the Central Library. It consists of 11 steps and is 1.5 metres high. It is covered in the names of those that died at Peterloo and the places from which they were born.